Welcome everyone to the webinar. My name is Anand Akela and I am the Chief Marketing Officer at Calvio Technologies. I'm joined by GigaOm analyst and the author of GigaOm Radar report for the deception technology, Chris Ray, and Suril Desai, who is our VP of Deception Engineering. Before I get started, let's make sure that you mute your microphone. Feel free to submit your question in Q&A during the presentation, and we'll take the questions at the end. We'll have a poll in the middle of the webinar as well, which will give you some time, and then we'll get started. But please feel free to ask your question, submit your question in the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as they come, and we will take it at the end. With that, let me hand it over to Suril to walk you through the agenda and start with the first part of the webinar before handing it over to Chris. Over to you, Suril.
Thanks, Anand. Right, so we'll talk about the agenda for today. We're going to discuss how the threat landscape has evolved in 2025 and what that implies for future cyber threat emerging attack vectors. We'll talk about the role of AI in the emerging threat landscape. Then we'll look at a couple of interesting APT attacks that have made a lot of created damage in the last year. For example, Salt Typhoon, which is one of the important threat actors that has been able to evade detection for a long time and compromise large enterprises. We'll analyze that and see what cyber deception can do to defend against that type of an attack vector. Then Chris will be providing you insights into the GigaOm Radar to talk about cyber deception, the role of deception in a security stack in 2025 and going forward. And then we'll look at a set of use cases for deception and how deception can be applied to solve modern cybersecurity challenges. That's the primary agenda for today. Now we'll look at from a threat landscape perspective, the last several months have been very transformative for cybersecurity from a defender perspective. I'll point your attention to a couple of salient pieces of interesting data that have been published with the emergence of LLM-based offensive techniques. So attackers are now able to use LLM agents to perform autonomous exploitation of vulnerabilities and actually gain access to enterprise resources. So for example, there's an interesting research paper that was published in November of 2024, where the researchers looked at LLM agents and have been able to identify that LLM agents are actually able to autonomously exploit and identify zero-day vulnerabilities. As we know, 0 days have been sort of the most challenging offense vector in security. Pretty much by definition, there is really no good way to defend against a 0 day because you don't have a known signature for it. And the reason 0 days have still been the defenders have been able to handle 0 days is because the skill level of the attacker to find a 0 day has been limited to very, very few advanced offensive security folks, right? So attackers have to be highly skilled to be able to find a 0 day. With the advances in AI, it is possible for LLM agents to autonomously look at open source software and find a 0 day vulnerability purely through code analysis. Lots of open source software is powering today's enterprises. If LLMs are able to find a 0 day purely by analyzing the source code, then pretty much you can imagine what the implications of such a finding would be. The number of 0 days are just going to explode. And because 0 days do not have a good known defense mechanism other than deception, it becomes very hard to be able to defend against this type of a threat vector. So that's basically one of the threat vectors in this area. Then we'll look at some other interesting research that has been published. So here is the next one, which is interesting study where there is a way to generate offensive PowerShell code purely through a natural language prompt. And so now the actual offensive security person just needs to provide a human prompt to say, generate me offensive script that can dump credentials from a Windows endpoint and extract credentials for lateral movement. You have to provide an English sentence of that nature. Out will come a valid working version of an offensive PowerShell script, which will be like a derivative of Mimikatz in PowerShell. And it can go and extract credentials from LSAS memory, and it can get access to these privileged credentials for the attacker to perform lateral movement. Now, the idea with this is that, again, this type of scripting was always possible earlier, but the skill level was again very different. It's not easy to go and extract credentials from LSAS memory because these internal data structures are not published by Microsoft. So only few people knew about this type of internals. Now, if the human can just provide an English prompt and the LLM does the actual job, the difficult job of converting that into valid working offensive scripts, this has again broad implications because now the human threat actor can simply provide a new prompt saying, do the same thing to extract credentials. This time, give me a slightly different variant of the script. And so it will now come with a valid script a second time around, but the script will be different, which means if you look at it from a signature point of view or a MD5 checksum, it will not match. And so any techniques that are anchored around looking at signatures or looking at checksums will not be able to find this type of scripts. And so that's basically a significant change on the threat landscape that has been brought about through the advances in AI. We'll look at some other interesting findings in the last 6 or 8 months. So the NSA and the Five Eyes intelligence agencies did a comprehensive research around Active Directory compromise. As we know, as defenders, Active Directory is a crown jewel that attackers target. A lot of the important data of an enterprise is available in Active Directory. And attackers have been going after Active Directory for a long time. But with the advances in offensive tooling, the number of stealthy Active Directory attacks have exploded. So this research published in September of 2024 talks about 17 commonly observed attacks against Active Directory. And it discusses what are the defense mechanisms to be able to defend against these attacks. And so from the research report, it talks about the challenges in being able to detect these type of threats. And the whole premise is that detecting Active Directory compromises can be very difficult. And that's because everything that is malicious in that attack sequence looks consistent with normal. And so, for example, if you look at an attack like Kerber roasting, or if you look at silver ticket attacks, these are type of attacks where everything malicious is being done outside the enterprise perimeter, but you're actually looking at the domain controller logs or looking at the network traffic. Everything looks legit, and so it's hard to be able to find these type of attacks unless you have the right type of defensive strategy. So that's basically a little bit of a context into identity exploits and what has changed in that part of the threat landscape. Now we'll look at Volt Typhoon. So as you know, there have been, both Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon have made a lot of media attention over the last 6 to 8 months. And Volt Typhoon in this case is one of the APT threats that has actually been able to remain undetected for several months, compromise lots of enterprises across different locations. And here is a quick analysis of the offensive attack lifecycle of Volt Typhoon. So the threat actor is doing reconnaissance against externally facing properties, and they're specifically looking for gateways or for web servers that are running bespoke software. Okay, so for example, third-party internet-facing gateways, load balancers, and they're trying to find a vulnerability against those. And the reason for that is it provides initial access to the threat actor without having any chance of getting detection, because those type of bespoke tooling does not have any EDR. There's very little log analytics for the logs on that particular third-party web server. So the threat actor knows that almost by definition, the defenders have no visibility into any exploit that goes against that type of a asset. So they do reconnaissance specifically looking for assets of that type. They perform vulnerability exploit. Every software has some CVE associated with it. And so they find the associated CVE And anything that is unpatched, they exploit it. They gain initial access. So now they have a foothold in the environment. And that foothold is something which is not having any detection tooling. And so they just sit there, right? And then they take their time to be able to plot the further lateral movement steps in the enterprise. And so in that offensive sequence, they do reconnaissance, typically against Active Directory. They look for interesting credentials, privileges. Then they go after AD because, again, just like the NSA published, AD attacks are difficult to detect. So they go after AD, get access to privileged credentials. Once they have a privileged credential, then they can laterally move in the environment because now they are actually impersonating a legitimate user and makes it very hard for traditional forms of detection to be able to find that. And they can laterally move across IT as well as pivot to OT. So that's basically what this type of a threat actor is actually doing in the attack lifecycle. We'll do a quick poll, Anand.
You will see a poll on your screen. Let's use next 30 seconds or so to answer it. How did Salt Typhoon evade detection? Targeting unmanaged endpoints, use of valid identities, use of living off the land techniques, or all of the above. Another 50 seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and I'll let Suril explain the answer, which most of you responded as all of the above.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's a multi-step sequence that these APTs are doing because no one step or no one technique is good enough to actually compromise a large enterprise, right? If you want to get in from the outside and then get all the way towards a production asset or a database or get access to call detail records, which are there in telecoms. So those type of sensitive data is stored somewhere deep inside the enterprise. So the attacker has to do a bunch of steps to get there. And so in order to do that, they need to do what is called as you have to sequence a chain of exploits to be able to get to your objective. And what these threat actors have started doing very well is that they're chaining the right sequence of exploits where they know that they can achieve their mission without having any risk of detection. So that's basically the sophistication level increase on the threat side. We'll look at, if you look at traditional security, one of the challenges why these solutions are not sufficient to defend against these modern threats, especially as they evolve, is that the traditional forms of detection have been focused around looking for a known threat with a known TTP. Okay, so you look at a particular offensive technique. For example, you look at the MITRE attack framework and you say, for this tactic and this technique, I need to build a specific detection rule for it. This is a valid approach, nothing wrong with it. Defenders should do it, but it is not sufficient because the idea is that the number of techniques are exploding. And then the second thing is when attackers use valid identities, use living off the land offensive techniques, everything malicious looks like normal. So finding this type of an activity using TTP centric detection becomes very challenging, and that's why threat actors are able to exploit these type of stealthy techniques in their offensive campaigns. So for example, here is a snippet of the Alfie Black Cat ransomware, which created havoc in 2024, where they spoke about they have a new variant called Sphinx variant of Alfie. And what that variant was doing is the research note published by the threat group says they have rewritten the ransomware, and the specific objective of the rewrite is to evade detection by, in this case, antivirus and EDR. And the whole reason for that is any TTP-centric detection could find a known ransomware. But if they try to change it and specifically rewrite it to evade detection, now it becomes very hard to find it. So that's basically things that the threat actors are actually doing and why traditional security is not sufficient. You need layers defense, TTP-centric is one layer, but you need to augment your security posture to add additional layers. So now the additional layer, which is an important foundational layer, is what we call as advanced deception tech. It's basically foundational for what we call as preemptive security or a proactive approach to cyber defense. So deception is basically based on completely different fundamental principles compared to TTP-centric detection. Deception is based on trying to dynamically change the landscape for the threat actor. So in traditional security solutions, there's no other technique other than deception and advanced moving target defense, AMTD. These are the only two techniques that are changing anything for the attacker. Everything else is all about observing. You monitor, you observe, and you analyze. But deception actually changes things for the attacker by placing active traps in the pathway of the attacker, right? So it's completely alters the perception, the cognition of the attacker. And so as a result, it impacts the threat actor in real time. So you can change the landscape. You can give the attacker a targeted opportunity to move in the environment. And by placing the right traps, which are based on the goals of the attacker instead of the techniques, you can actually get an early detection and you can get precision because nobody should be going after these deceptive traps in the first place. And so any attempt to do that results in an alert. So now, as a defender, the deceptions can be placed at multiple places. You can have deceptions placed on endpoints, in identity stores, in the network, and in cloud environments. So if you look at it from an attacker's point of view, so the attacker gets in onto an endpoint, let's say by phishing, and that endpoint is typically not the goal of the attacker. So the attacker wants to get towards a high value asset. So the attacker needs to do some amount of reconnaissance. When they do reconnaissance, there are three places that the attacker can do reconnaissance on. On the endpoint, which is the machine zero where they landed, in the network, and in the catalog, which is like an Active Directory. So if you, as a defender, can set traps at all of these places, so you have what we call as breadcrumbs and baits, which are endpoint deceptions added to the endpoint, decoys added to the network, and honey tokens added to the catalog. Now you have a better way of getting comprehensive detection coverage for the attacker. So now if you look at Salt Typhoon, if once we place deceptions, there can be various type of deceptions that can be placed to give an early warning for a threat actor like Salt Typhoon. For example, starting from the initial access, one can create public-facing properties that represent an internet gateway. It can even represent a vulnerable version deliberately set for the attacker. So the attacker is doing external reconnaissance. They can find such an entity. They try to go after it. At that stage itself, the defender can alert. Now, beyond that, there are other places as well. For example, you can set traps in the Active Directory as honey tokens that represent privileged accounts, which are interesting for the attacker. You could make it Kerberos-stable. So now they give relevant opportunities for the threat actor, and you can get visibility into that type of attack sequence. And you can also set traps that represent high-value assets. For example, a production database, which contains important data, can be created as a decoy. When the attacker is doing reconnaissance, they can find such a target and they go after it. Chris, over to you.
Very good. Thanks, Surreal and Anand. You guys have done a really good job of setting the table, talking about what's at stake. I want to go back for a moment and talk about the AI impacts. You touched on it. The reason that I, as an analyst and a former practitioner, fell in love with the deception technology topic because I have the freedom to select any topic that I want to research. I said, let's do deception. This is something that's not covered. It has some significant impacts, real outcomes. It can really bolster a lot of security programs. Let's cover this in depth. Like you touched on, Gen AI, LLMs, they are accelerating the speed at which attackers are able to iterate and change their tactics, which creates one heck of a mess for the blue team, for anyone trying to detect this stuff. There's that. Traditionally, I view deception technology as the means to fill the gaps between your security controls, between your EDR, between your CNAP, between your container security. There's always going to be gaps there, and deception fills those gaps really well. But now in the last 12 months, maybe a little bit longer, with the acceleration of attacker techniques evolving like they have, what's happening is now they're ahead of not deception, they're ahead of detection techniques, traditional blue team strategies. So there's this giant gap between skill sets and expertise. And I'm finding that that's where deception is really benefiting users right now, is they're filling that gap while we play catch up, providing that coverage for something that doesn't exist today. So with that, let's jump into the radar and talk a little bit about, what I do, how we do it, and how we arrived at the conclusions of my research, which you see presented here. So at GigaOm, I'm an analyst. I wasn't a journalist like some analysts are. I was a practitioner. I was hands-on. I was an implementer. I've worked a variety of roles in all sorts of different operations, security operations, some security admin stuff. And because of that, I have, let's say, unique insights when I'm reviewing technologies. What actually makes impacts, what does not. And from that, we are able to establish table stakes, key features, emerging features. Those are the key capabilities of the technology, in this case, deception, that you as a buyer need to be aware of. But we also give you business criteria. How do you evaluate these solutions to make sure they're going to be a good fit for you? The culmination of all of that measuring results in what you see here. Obviously, higher scores closer to center, but we also look at, is it a feature play? Is it a platform play? Is it going to remain relatively the same, be a mature solution over the contract lifecycle? That's the top half. Or is it going to change dramatically over the 1, 2, 3 year engagement that you may have with your contract term? Those would be the solutions on the bottom half. If you want to move on to the next one, Cyril. So as I mentioned, with each report topic that I cover, and deception's no different, we have to establish what is the bare minimum to be considered a deception technology solution. Not on this slide, but we have it established. We have table stakes. Those are the things that, in order to be deception, you must do these things. Those are bread and butter. Everyone that's in the deception space, regardless of which solution you purchase, they will have those capabilities. We move up the stack, though. We look at key features. This is how you differentiate the different solutions out there. Now, there are a lot of key features. We can't measure all of them. So what we do is we pick the most impactful, the most important key features. And that's what you see here, the cloud native deception, the ability to support multiple platforms, behavioral analysis, the ability to customize how you engage with the attackers, with your breadcrumbs, your tokens, your honeypots, whatever they are. Multiple layer deception, so not just focusing on application or network, but all of them. And then OT and IoT specific decoys is something that's exploding in popularity for good reason, because they're very effective. Moving even further up the stack, we have emerging features, which these are the things that are maybe bleeding edge, right on the edge of what's capable and what's possible today. We've identified identity focused deception, so like you said, the Active Directory tokens and things like that, as well as a built-in LLM assistant to help the users of the deception technology platform operate and administer the solution effectively. You can go ahead and move on, Cyril. And then, like I mentioned, we give you some methods to evaluate the solution. So these are non-functional evaluation metrics. We call them business criteria. How much does it cost? How much does it cost? How does it scale? How flexible is the solution? What does its ecosystem look like? Meaning its integrations, its official partnerships, how mature are those integrations? And then finally, ease of use. These are all equally important. None are weighted more than the other because there's only 5 here. This gives you a really good basis to evaluate a solution when you're considering it for your environment. And then, as you have here, Cyril, Shadowplex is unique in not just the deception space, but across a lot of topics I cover. It's not often that I review or research a vendor solution that scores well pretty much across the board. Usually there's going to be something that it doesn't do well. You expect a low score. In this case, we score 0 to 5, 5 being excellent, 0 is it doesn't do it at all. It's not unusual to have a leading solution with, a 2 or a 3. But in this case, Shadowplex, it does all of those key features well. that I outlined on the last page, plus the emerging features. That's something that you guys have really dug in on, especially the identity-focused deception. As you can see here, this is a graphical layout, like I was just talking about, cloud native, cross-platform, behavioral analysis, et cetera, to the right. Those are the key features. We score 0 to 5, and you can see there's a lot of 5s and 4s there.
So thanks, Chris. And so we'll talk about some of the use cases and deception strategies, especially with reference to the report. So we'll cover the scenarios for detection, hunting, and threat intel. We'll cover 3 scenarios. So what do you?
Certainly. So adversarial misuse of AI. Like I touched on, like you touched on, like I touched on, being able to articulate in your native language, English or whatever it is, into a prompt and saying, I'm trying to achieve this. Write a script that does this. Well, then you've probably, as an attacker, you have a library of scripts like that ready to go. You can go onto GitHub and find all sorts of things to build off from. You can use that to piece together something that's novel. It's new. It's never been seen. So, you can use a living off the land technique that's never been observed before. You'll probably circumvent a lot of EDRs, because it's another space I cover. And that's definitely a challenge for those. If we're talking about moving into the cloud space, finding novel ways to interact with APIs is really, it's almost table stakes for an LLM assistant at this point, or somebody using ChatGPT or Claude or whatever the case may be. So what we're seeing is, as attackers, as adversaries are iterating, that's only lengthening that gap that I mentioned between the detection in the blue teams and the attacker's tactics. It's making the defenders' jobs even more difficult.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll see one scenario of how deception can be used to defend against identity threats, especially the ones that use AI and LLMs. So this is an identity attack known as AS rep roasting. You would be familiar with this type of an offensive technique. Fundamentally, it is a way for the attacker to be able to get access to credentials. And so, it's an attack against the Kerberos protocol in Active Directory. And the attack lifecycle enables the attacker to get access to the credential. So now this type of an attack is very hard to detect using traditional forms of detection. So let's look at how the attack builds out and see what deception can do in this area. So here is an attacker who's actually using a LLM-assisted exploit sequence. So they run a set of reconnaissance commands to generate an offensive script and find a user in Active Directory that is actually vulnerable to what is called as AS rep roasting. Once they find such a user, then they use a tool called Rubius, which is a very popular offensive tool that can actually perform the AS rep roasting part of the exploit. So here the exploit sequence is being performed. And now this gets access to the credential. So now the attacker, when they finish this exploit sequence, they have the user's credential. Now, if you look at this type of an attack sequence, it's very hard to detect this type of an attack using log analytics or rule-based detection because it's highly stealthy and it doesn't generate events or noise in the environment that can be used as a detection instrument. Let's look at what deception can do for defending against an attack of this nature. So the idea is that, so now, for example, the attacker is attempting lateral movement. And when they try to attempt lateral movement at that stage, they will get detected because this was actually a deception placed by Shadowplex in the environment. So we have given an opportunity to the attacker. So created an additional account in Active Directory, set certain attributes in that account that make it look like it is vulnerable to AS rep roasting. And now the defender does not need to care whether the attacker used an LLM assisted agent or they were a human crafted offensive sequence. Ultimately, they're going to look at those type of characteristics, and by setting such a trap, the defender will get an alert. So the moment the attacker attempts to use this type of exploit, you get an alert and you can know that this type of exploit sequence was being performed. So that's one scenario. We'll take a different scenario about cloud. Chris, you'd like to talk about this?
Sorry about that. So again, so many of the attack avenues are still the same. You know, we still have endpoint concerns. We still have misconfigured cloud service concerns. We still have containerized workload security concerns. However, the speed at which the tactics are changing is really what's driving, I think, a lot of the concern that blue teams have. So when we're talking about cloud native security, even though AWS, Azure, Google, OCI, take your pick, they've been around 15 plus years now at this point. We still are not experts at provisioning and securing those cloud services. And so because of that, it's I don't want to say low hanging fruit because it's more difficult than that, but it's of all the fruits available to an attacker to pick, it is definitely lower hanging because it's sprawly. It morphs, it changes, it could be daily. So what's secure today may not exist tomorrow. So what we're seeing there is, again, leveraging LLMs, taking what they've already known to use and to work, using plain language to describe what their outcomes are. They could even go in and say, hey, you know, I've used this before, change this a little bit so that the outcome is the same, but the scripting is different. All of that's possible to interact maliciously with APIs, which ultimately drive the services under the hood in a lot of cloud service providers.
So we'll look at a scenario on the cloud side. So here is a case where the attacker is actually doing what is called as a living off the cloud attack. So we are all as defenders familiar with living off the land attacks on on-premise environments where attackers are using built-in tooling. Similarly, in cloud, as Chris mentioned, they're using existing APIs. They're not really using a lot of malware. So using built-in cloud primitives and APIs to perform offensive sequence. So here is a case where the attacker gets into a cloud workload and they're doing some enumeration, looking for, in this case, it's an AWS environment. So they're looking for an IAM role that has administrative privileges. This is an attempt by the attacker to be able to elevate their privileges and gain administrative access to the cloud workload. So they're doing that type of an enumeration. So the attacker does the enumeration, they try to find such a role. And as part of that attack lifecycle, they do several steps in the reconnaissance sequence. They're trying to make sure that they are actually going after a role that has the right permissions associated with it. So they do a 2-3 step recon process. I'll just let that build out so that you have the context. So the attacker is now looking for the policies attached with the role, and they're also going to look at the associated permissions. When they do the permissions reconnaissance, now the attacker knows that this is an interesting administrative role because they see that the role has permissions to start and stop a database in the cloud environment, for example, an RDS instance. Now that type of a permission is always an administrative permission. So it's always interesting for the attacker. So the attacker goes in and they attempt to assume such a role because it's worth their while to do it, and it can escalate privileges for the attacker. So the attacker then goes and they attempt to do a role assumption. This attacker's attempt is actually denied. And what the attacker does not realize is that this is actually a honey token role that Acalvio has placed in the environment. It's a Shadowplex role. And so when they try to go after it, the defender will get an alert. And so the defender gets to know that this type of an activity is occurring in the environment. You can know where the attacker is present, and you can actually detect cloud native attacks with precision. So that's basically one other strategy of getting early warning for identity threats in cloud native workloads. Okay. And we'll cover a last use case around OT, Chris.
Certainly. So OT or ICS, IoT, all of them, you can kind of lump them together right now as we're talking about this. They are environments which unfortunately are lagging far behind the IT environments. They are catching up. I don't know how quickly. I don't want to quantify it. They are getting better. But as far as the environments themselves go, there are practices and there are architectures that exist in OT, IoT environments that could never exist in an IT environment because they're so insecure. So because of that, what we're finding is There's opportunities to deploy a lot of security technologies into OT environments to control access, to monitor better, to look for malicious behavior. And then there's also deception, which can do everything very well. And it's almost like OT environments were primed for deception to come and get dropped into it because there are so many gaps. And deception is so universal and comprehensive at the same time that I think a lot of buyers are considering deception maybe for the first time. They may not have used it in their IT environment, but they're looking at the challenges in OT and saying, I think this is a really good first step because of the coverage that we get out of it.
Thanks, Chris. So we'll take a look at a quick OT defender scenario. So here is basically a case where the attacker is going after what is called as a PLC. And so they're going to go after a programmable logic controller. It can be from any equipment manufacturer. So they're doing some reconnaissance, looking for a PLC in the environment. And so they try to find a corresponding PLC. They find the respective port open. And when they're trying to go after that, now these type of assets are very hard for defenders to protect because there's no EDR, you cannot get access to the logs. So attackers, as Chris mentioned, are explicitly targeting those type of OT assets. And so there are always exploits applicable against those assets. So for example, in this case, the attacker is using Metasploit and trying to do some reconnaissance to find applicable vulnerability associated with that OT asset. So they do some reconnaissance and eventually they find that there is a vulnerability associated. There's a particular instruction called stop CPU, which allows you to actually stop a particular PLC and impact its operation. This can be very damaging to the OT environment because it can actually bring down the manufacturing facility if the attacker succeeds. So it's very important to be able to detect such an attack. And so one way to detect that is to place a deceptive PLC in the environment. And now if the attacker goes after that, because the attacker does not know that that's a trap, the defender will immediately get an alert. And so the defender knows that that type of an instruction was attempted. And so you can now, before your OT environment is impacted, you can actually do something about it and cut off the attacker and protect your assets. So that gives you a quick perspective into some set of modern deception strategies and how we can defend against these emerging threats that are. All right, we can open up for Q&A. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Cyril. Chris, let's get into the questions. Okay. The first one is how to make deception network undetectable by APTs. Sophisticated APTs recognize many deception network and do not perform major operations once identify deception. Any recommendations to make deception network appears to be more legit?
Yeah, and I think there's two things to call out there. One is thwarting attacker behavior is as effective as detecting it, right? If attackers, you hear this when you talk to pen testers all the time. We get into an environment, we think we found some element of deception. We have to move more slowly. We have to be more thoughtful. We need to find a different way to try to achieve our outcomes. I mean, that's a benefit of deception, is that unknown, is that maybe we are going to avoid this asset or this identity because we think it's deception. We're going to have to find another way. There's value in that. The second part is, this is where it comes down to one of the key features identified, which is your ability to customize the engagement level. That's what I call it. It's kind of a vague term, but think about it as if you're using tokens, maybe the token has a URL in it. Can you modify that token URL to be specific to your organization? Can you add context to it that makes sense for where the token is placed? That's an important capability that not all deception technologies have. So as you're looking at the landscape out there, ask questions around, how do I customize my tokens? How do I customize these so it mimics my environment so that it doesn't stand out? It looks like something else in the herd out there.
Thanks, Chris. Cyril, do you have to add anything?
No, we're good. Yeah, great.
That's good. All right, the next question is, what is the level of upkeep required for deceptions to continue to be effective as the threat landscape evolves with LLM-driven attacks? What should I do to keep these deception fresh and relevant? And before you answer the question, I want to encourage everyone to, we have some time. We could take questions, as many as they can get. So please feel free to submit your question in the Q&A tab right at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead,
Certainly.
Cyril.
So go ahead, Cyril.
Go ahead, Chris, sorry.
Okay. So this gets back to actually something that I established as a table stake, meaning deployment management is a table stake for deception technologies. You have to be able to manage the artifacts, the deception artifacts that you've deployed centrally through your deception technology platform, whatever that may be. It's considered table stakes because they all do it, but even then, there's some nuance in how they do it and how effective they are. So if you're considering deception, but you're also concerned about what's the overhead, what's the operational load that this is going to create, generally a good deception platform will front load a lot of the operational burden, meaning the initial configuration, building the context, choosing the deception styles and techniques that you want to use. You get that all done out front, and then as you integrate it with your systems, it becomes very automated with a good solution. Now, I should point out, although this is table stakes, we don't measure, we don't score table stakes. There is still quite a bit of variance in how each solution helps you manage your deployment. So definitely an area that you want to focus in on as you're reviewing the solutions you may purchase.
Yeah, and I think, I completely echo Chris's points. And I would say that from a, if you look at it, there's a threat landscape topic, but there's also how the assets are moving. And so deception platforms need to worry more about the assets than the threats, because the threats will continue to emerge, but deception is almost by definition agnostic to the threat vector, but deception is very much centered to the asset changes, as Chris spoke about. And so one needs a good quality deception platform, needs to be aware of changes in the asset landscape. So for example, you need to perform ongoing discovery of the environment. Did new assets get added? Did assets get removed? Is a new high value asset been provisioned? And as those changes occur, then the deception platform should be able to keep pace with that without requiring the administrator to be able to go and manually configure it every time, because that becomes otherwise a lot of care and feed. So if you use automation and you use AI on the defender side, you can achieve that.
Yeah, I think that you encapsulated what I was trying to get out there. I just couldn't find the words to do it. Attacker techniques are evolving. They're changing. So detection techniques based on detecting TTPs and those attacker behaviors, those will need to be updated as those things change. But deception is fundamentally different in that it's focusing on the objectives or the outcomes of the attack. The outcomes and the objectives have remained relatively constant over even the last 5 years. You could stretch it out 10 years. So because of that, deception technology is really powerful when it comes to protecting your crown jewel assets, keeping an eye on data access, because that's really what they're trying to do. Broad system changes. You're detecting outcomes. You're not detecting the steps in between, which is, the steps in between is the part that takes a lot of care and maintenance.
Thanks, guys. All right, let's take next question. OT for OT ICS deception. ICS tech is usually not maintained much. For example, HMI system actuators are not bothered to be updated. Recommendations to avoid APTs detecting deception network system in specific the OT and IC environment.
Yeah, so they're not wrong. OT environments are famous for being outdated and unpatched and unmanaged almost. It's not unusual to go into an OT environment and find that maybe there's a controller for a large system that's on Windows XP or Windows ME or Windows 2000 or even older. I've seen Windows 98 in an OT environment before. Those systems are unbelievably vulnerable. So there's that aspect of it. Obviously, mimicking or deploying deception that appears to be an ancient system like that, that's one avenue. But if we look more specifically at OT assets, this is where you can really differentiate some of the solutions that are, they lend themselves to the OT environment because they mimic, Rockwell or Siemens or whatever the major manufacturers are. You can actually mimic that firmware on the network. So as an attacker is enumerating, as they're discovering the environment, they find legitimate PLCs, for instance. But within those legitimate ones, you've got one it could be a clone of your PLC that's out there, indistinguishable. So as the attacker moves through their stages and they interact with it, well, now you've detected them.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. All right, I think there's a question. I have tried to deploy a few deceptions manually. Is this not sufficient?
Some is better than none, but I'm sure anyone who's deployed deception manually knows that it's very labor intensive. If you're not using some sort of tool to manage the deployment process, now you're probably, if it's a token-based deployment, you're emailing tokens, you're leaving a trace of, what your defensive strategy is in your email. If your email ever gets compromised, you can guarantee attackers are going to look for things like that to learn about the environment. There's that aspect of it. The people implementing the tokens may not be able to follow directions perfectly. Maybe they're not technical, and you're asking them to put it somewhere in their downloads folder, and they just drop it in documents. You're relying a lot on the manual communications to ensure that, hey, this process was completed. It's not tied into any of the lifecycle management. So as these laptops or endpoints get deprovisioned, well, now you've lost visibility. That token's gone. Maybe it's not deployed to the new one. So manually deploying is fraught with all sorts of headaches. But I will say, getting some deception deployed is better than no deception. But you quickly figure out or find out that you're going to wish you had some sort of automated deployment strategy, whether that's built into the solution or through some sort of integration with like an MDM or a mature cloud service provider.
Sounds good. Let's take one more question. How to keep APTs occupied with continuous forced fake data system engagement in the deception attack to capture the TTPs? Recommendations?
But this gets back to the customization of the engagement level, but also another key feature, the multi-layer deception. So not just having identity, as a deception component, having something that mimics an application, having something on the network, having something as a cloud service. Those are multiple layers that you can blend together. So while they may interact with the identity, and like the example you gave with the Kerber roasting attack, they may interact with it. You can gather their TTPs from there, but they're going to proceed. They're going to progress. They may not realize that that's a deception item that they're interacting with. So then on the lateral movement, you get to gather those TTPs as they move maybe to an application or to a cloud service. So it's really looking at deploying deception across your technology stack. And I don't mean the different products, but literally think about the OSIs, the OSI layers, trying to get as many of those OSI layers covered as possible. That will give you more opportunity to observe the attacker as they move through your environment.
Thanks. Someone is asking, Jeffrey, you're asking if he was able to join later. Will there be a recording? Yes, we'll send you a recording. All right. I think there are a few questions coming from, maybe we could follow up with the individual who has many other questions here. Let's see if there's anything else here. What are the recommendations around the type of deception should I start with? Where should I start, basically? Decoys, honey tokens, there were a lot of different names.
Yeah, this is a challenge. When you start this kind of a project, you need to have a very narrow scope. And along with that narrow scope, you need to define what success is. This is not too similar from any other project. You need to have an end state in mind. You need to know what that looks like. So I'll give an example. Let's say you're concerned about endpoints, your employees' endpoints, staff. Maybe pick one business unit, marketing, sales, operations. And then within that business unit, try to find a group of users that you either already have relationships established with. You can talk to them freely. You can meet with them easily. If you can't do that, then just pick a business unit. But then define, in the context of this business unit, if we say it's sales, what deception makes sense? Should I be looking at identity based? Should I be looking at a token that maybe it's a macro enabled Word document, something along those lines? So you have to consider the context and then say the outcome here is 100% coverage of this token in this business unit. When I achieve that, this portion of the project is done. And then sit back and look at it and say, okay, what is the care and feeding? What's the maintenance look like for what I've just done? If you have a good technology solution, good deception technology solution, it should be minimal to none. If there's other ones, then you're gonna have to evaluate that. But that's how I would start. Scope it down, define the objectives, complete that one objective, and really kind of look back and say, what did I learn that I didn't know? How can I improve this? And then how hard is it going to be to expand the scope and achieve the same objectives?
Sounds good. Thanks, Chris. So I see there are a few questions that are kind of specific to the product. Maybe we could for public education on deception and strategy. Maybe we'll follow up what the individual and us and answer those questions. So this time, I think only the 2 or 3 of those questions left, which I'm going to follow up later and answer. So at this time, no other questions from anyone at this time. Let's see, what did I get? Anything? Okay. Let's take this. What do the results of deception show as to what is the best way to start? I think you kind of touched on it, but maybe just let's take this one real quick before we go.
So what do the results of deception tell us about starting, about where to start? Is that kind of where I'm going at? In smaller environments, you'll often find you'll deploy deception and not hear from it for months. That's because it's such a high fidelity method of detecting bad things. If you have a small environment, there'll be fewer bad things happening. It's just a result of the math. In larger environments, though, the feedback, the learning curve will be more rapid. So if you look at it from that aspect, again, taking that scoping project that we talked about, if you have a larger environment, maybe define 3 scopes. Endpoints is one, some sort of cloud service at a very narrow scope is another, and then identity, whatever your identity provider is. Execute those and then see which ones are generating a lot of false positives, if there are any. Okay, well, maybe reconsider your approach to that. Which ones are deployed, but they're not deployed optimally? Maybe the context is off. You've spun up new services that you don't use in your environment as deception. That's not a good idea. So really going through that practice, evaluating the effectiveness on their own, that will kind of help you tailor in what deception strategy makes the most sense for your organization, because there are some where tokens just don't provide the value that honeypots do. And there are some where honeypots don't provide the value that tokens can.
Yeah, and from an implementation point of view, generally our customers have 2 strategies. So one strategy is a starting point is where the attacker can enter from. For example, the user network, the DMZ, because that's sort of the starting point where the attacker will enter. So that becomes one good place to start. The other way to start is where the attacker will go toward, which is the high value assets, typically in the data center, let's say. So typically you can start from both extreme ends of the equation, entry point, which is the user network, as Chris mentioned, and then the data center, which is the key value assets. And then you cover these 2, and then you merge towards the middle. So that can be a phased rollout. So you start with the 2 extreme ends and then come towards the middle. Great.
Makes sense.
Thanks, guys. I think with that, let's conclude this session. We'll have the recording sent out to everyone who has registered for the webinar. Thanks again, Chris, for your time,